Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I hope and trust that you are all well. Before I get started, I would like to give a special shout out to the reform members of Back to Ashes, Corpse Lover 450, Gwen Haley, Manna Ash, Normie DW, Chrissy Elias, Cindy Cleveland, Patty's niece, and Samantha Place. The rest of the membership family can be found right here on your screen. If you would like to become a member of Back to Ashes, or would like to buy me a coffee as a thank you token, all of that information can be found below in the description box. With all of that being said, it is time to go back to ashes, for when we arise from the ashes, we are a bigger, brighter, stronger, and a happier person in the morning. Sit back, relax, kick back, grab a snack, or tuck in to get warm, and prepare for this dose of vocal melatonin entitled True Middle of Nowhere Stories. Right after this intro, an ad will play. I'll read the first story, an ad will play, and after that, there will be no more ads within this video. I used to work for an IT company in the gaming industry whose office was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by farms and forest. One day, one of the development team had come in from a walk in the forest and was visibly upset. Turns out, she came across a dead fox. The thing that was concerning is that she said it was hanging from a tree and looks like it was put there on purpose. So, a little bit later on, a few of us went down to have a look. We came across a small clearing with a dead fox hanging there. Upon closer inspection, we realized it had been hung by its neck, with an incision from its testicles to its throat and all of its insides pulled out. I felt pretty sick after that one. We got it down from the branch and chucked it into the bushes, away from the path and clearing. Still, to this day, we have no idea how or why it was in that state. This happened when I was 13. I was at a church camp, which had a cliff nearby. Of course, my two tent mates and I snuck out during the middle of the night to go and see the stars. It was a magnificent view. We were all from the city, so being in the middle of the forest, out in the middle of nowhere, was exciting, since we couldn't see many stars at home. So we hiked a half-mile to the cliff and stand there for a few minutes in silence. Across the valley, I see a light on the mountain. I assumed it was a car, because it was going sideways like it was on a road. But then it started to go straight down the mountain, which would have been impossible for a car because no roads go straight down it. The light started to speed up and was heading right towards us. The light made it to the bottom of the huge mountain within 2 to 3 minutes. I'd say it was going 50 to 70 miles an hour. We all stood our ground, not saying a word. When it got to the valley, it went even faster and was still coming right towards us. We saw it still only had one massive light instead of two like a car, and it was huge. I don't think a dirt bike could have that big of a light, even in the dark. The moon was so bright, you could have gotten away with no headlights. We finally ran when it got 3/4 of the way across the valley. It was strangely terrifying. Once the light appeared, there was a heavy feeling of horror that we only talked about once. One friend thought it was so scary, she pushed us down to get by us, while we were running up the hill on the way to the camp. In the morning, we told the grown-ups about it, and they didn't really believe us. One said there was a sighting of a strange man who was snooping around, so the light was a warning to get back to camp. I suppose being a mile away, in the dark, as 13-year-olds, it's pretty dangerous, or seems dangerous. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits, and it could have just been dirt bikes or something, but I haven't had that feeling of pure terror since then. I don't work out in the woods or anything, but me and my dad were hunting in the Poconos, So me and my dad were sitting in a hunting tower. It was cold as balls out. And we start hearing what sounded like one of those old religious chants where they sing all together in Latin while walking in a straight line. It kept getting closer till we saw movement about 20 meters ahead. And then we saw a group of about 10 to 30 people wearing all white, holding candles. And then about 5 more people with rifles and shotguns standing in the front, to the back, and on the sides. We let them pass and they were staring at us as they walked by. Needless to say, it was scary as hell. About 10 minutes after they walked by, we went over to where they were standing. And it was snowy out there, and there were 0 footsteps in the snow. Until this day, we still don't know what the hell we saw. My story isn't exactly what was asked for, but should be good padding while this post is so new. In middle school, I worked at the school during the summer, doing general painting and helping the maintenance guys. We had to drive out to the middle of effing nowhere off of Floridian Forest to pick up some pine lumber for the gym's new bleachers. And when we got to the mill at like 7 a.m., the whole place was locked down with police. They had found gasoline cans and pill bottles out in one of the tree farm groves, telltale signs of kids abusing substances. But supposedly, the cops were there because they found human remains. I was pretty young and I don't remember anything outside of my little kid point of view, but I remember seeing streaks of dark blood running up the trunks of several pines. I've since learned from the guys I was with that a teenager was killed by a bear after attacking it, and the blood was either from the wounded bear climbing the tree or dragging a hurt person up with it. But I'm sure many of you can agree with me that bears don't do that, and I can't see any uninjured bear making it up several pine trees in a row while bleeding that much. So technically, I saw a creepy thing while at work in a remote area. Look up Lakeland Mill casualties or something to find it. The story of the kid's death was in the local paper. I'm not sure if this counts because it's a farm, but when you live on a farm, you work on a farm. So I guess I'll tell it considering we were really out in the middle of nowhere. I grew up on a farm and in high school used to mess with my friends by hiding and making them find me. One night, my friend was over and we were waiting on this other dude. We see him pull up, so we take off running to hide. It's funny because they have to wander around somewhere they're unfamiliar with, or go ask my parents and be told, too bad, you'll have to find her. It's like forced hide and seek. Anyway, this one night I saw my friend hide in one building while I ran for the trees. I was hiding under some bushes and heard breathing. Like human breathing. There were no animals around. It creeped me out so bad, I ran out of hiding to greet my friend. I felt so uncomfortable for the rest of the night. Sometime during the night, my dad heard something and went out to investigate. In the morning, he discovered that one of our cows was killed and butchered. This never happens to us, so still to this day, we wondered, what could it have been? I was in southeast Alaska for around 15 days a few summers ago. We had just finished up dinner and washed our pots and pans and gone to our respective tents in the trees along the shore we had stopped at for the night. The stop we had chosen to camp wasn't ideal. The tide was set to come in pretty far that night, and it would only leave us with a few feet before the water would be lapping at our tent flaps. But we also didn't care that much, as it had been raining and incredibly windy that day, so kayaking was hardly any fun at all, and we needed to stop. About 45 minutes after we had said goodnight to one another, I heard some splashing in the tidal zone, probably 20 feet from my tent. I didn't think much of it because a few times before, when in Alaska, we had stopped at beaches where the tide had risen to within a few feet away from our tents. Anyway, I tried to ignore it, although in my mind I'm freaking the hell out. Our camp spot was less than ideal if you wanted to escape in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. We were at the base of a relatively steep hill that was covered in alders and slick with rain. To the left, probably 70 feet from where we camped there, was a rocky outcrop that went out into the water. It was about 20 feet tall and steep enough that you couldn't climb it. If, for example, a grizzly bear, and there were a lot out that time of the summer, we had seen 4 or 5 that day alone, patrolling beaches, wanted to see what was going on down at the beach and walked towards us from the right, it would basically seal off our movement. Sort of like putting the cork back in the wine bottle. Not many places to go. Anyway, after 15 minutes of hearing splashing, I start to try to rationalize it enough to go to sleep. But that's when I start hearing something other than splashing. This incredibly high-pitched gargling sound breaks through the night's relative quiet. It sounded as though 2 cats had gotten into a fight, but every time they let out a scream, the other cat would push the one cat's head underwater. This went on for a good 20 minutes. After it died down, I hear, "That's weird, huh?" from another tent, obviously trying to downplay the incident. I, being scared as hell, just reply, "Yep, going back to sleep." Another 15 minutes pass without much sound, but then the same gargling breaks through the night, this time much, much closer. The noises are deeper this time, more guttural. It sounds like an old man fighting with a cat, and each time either of them shriek, they are forced underwater. The splashing intensifies, and it sounds like it's right outside my tent. I think that the fear of whatever was going on eventually just zapped me of all energy because eventually I fell back asleep. I just remember that I didn't move a muscle, and I didn't move for so long that all of my muscles ached after a while, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat all night long. Anyway, we woke up, had breakfast, broke down the tents, and got back on the road. Didn't hear it ever again. A few weeks later, I did some Googling, and I'm pretty sure that it was just some sea otters fighting each other in the intertidal zone. But it sure was scary as hell. The next time we do any camping this close to the water with those creatures around, I will make sure we go during the correct season. I was out camping with my friend Josiah in the mountains of Pennsylvania. It was the weird in-between season after winter, but before spring really kicks off. Still no leaves on the trees, but the day of hiking to the camping spot was about 60 degrees. I brought a small rifle as we wanted to do some plinking while we were out. We set up the camp at about 3 p.m., loving that we found a spot in the middle of nowhere, leaving plenty of time for shooting. Just 2 buddies shooting guns out in the middle of the PA Mountains. It was an incredible day. Night began to fall upon us, the air began to chill, and we built a fire for the night. Breaking out the bourbon, we talked about everything from future plans, girlfriends, and how society sucks. Josiah was used to camping, an industrious guy who had a passion for the outdoors. but, to put it kindly, was not the smartest person I have ever met. From across the next mountain, we began to hear coyotes. This is common when camping in Pennsylvania. Something you should know about coyotes is that they are incredibly noisy and you can hear them calling for miles away. Coyotes are also completely terrified of people and, therefore, not a danger in the slightest. Or so I thought. The coyote calls were getting closer. Fine, we thought, as they were probably just using the trails to move more efficiently between the mountain peaks. This comfort and logic dissolved over the next hour or two as the chilling howls kept getting closer. Josiah casually mentions that the coyotes are close, but he knew as well as I did that they were avoiding us. Shortly after he said this, the calls stopped. We were in complete silence. The pops and flickers of the dying campfire was our only indication that time itself had been frozen. The bushes behind us began to rustle. Grabbing my flashlight, I scanned the woods around Josiah and me, only to catch the reflection of about a half-dozen sets of eyes in a half circle all around us. We both realize what is happening at the same time. Josiah grabs the rifle, hands it to me, and in return, I hand him the flashlight. I slowly chamber a round into the semi-automatic .22 caliber rifle, realizing that I probably don't have enough firepower to stop all of these coyotes should the situation continue to escalate. Josiah and I stand with our backs towards the fire, him using the light to illuminate each coyote the moment they break a twig underneath their movements. The coyotes, once illuminated, let out a bark, then move behind a tree. It appears as if hunting us is a game to them. As we stand there, playing this game of high-stakes flashlight tag with a rifle, I come to presume that these dogs are coming out of a very harsh winter, and are probably starved. The standoff lasts for hours. Just as quickly as they surrounded us, they vanished into the blackness of the forest, only to resume their haunting calls on other mountains. I slept with a rifle that night. To this day, I still don't know why a typically harmless animal made us fight for our lives that night. The next morning, the situation didn't get any better. Central Pennsylvania has odd weather snaps. The day before, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This morning, there was about 3 inches of snow on the ground. Temperatures were below 10 degrees and heavy snowstorms were rolling in. This was uncalled for by every weather agency I checked before we set out on this adventure. We packed for temperatures as low as 30 degrees, not this tundra. Hands were bright red, dexterity lost. I have been cold before, but this was the first time I was cold and unprepared enough to worry. Forget cooking breakfast. We need to get out of here before the snow picks up. We tear down tents, put on as many layers as possible, stretching shirts over each other, pack bags, and clean the site in less than an hour. We make our way down the War Trophy Mountain that we battled for the night prior, but the trails below are covered by unpacked snow. We were going to have to use map and compass. We were also going to have to trailblaze through more difficult terrain if we wanted to make it to the car. We find a felled tree, lay out the map in the quickly accumulating snow, and try to orient ourselves. If you have never been cold, hungry, and most likely dehydrated, while trying to identify mountain peaks and where they correspond on a map, then let me be the first to tell you that it is an aggravating experience where any decision could mean the difference between living and dying. We find 3 identifiable peaks, see the creek that we crossed in the previous morning, and have a plan to get through the 5 miles as quickly as possible in a straight shot. This wasn't a typical hiking pace. We were just short of jogging, both to keep body temperatures up and to expedite the trek until we could get into my used Saturn Vue and pray that the heat worked. 4 inches of snow now were weighing down our footsteps. As we approached the creek, we remembered that the bridge that we crossed before was another 3 miles out of our way, a distance we were unwilling to add to our already suffering bodies. We need to find a way over this water that was only beginning to freeze but quickly. Josiah heads northwest along the riverbank to look for a method of crossing. I direct myself southwest to do the same. The instructions were to not walk more than 200 meters away from the central location, so that we could still hear each other calling that a solution was found. Within a few minutes, I hear Josiah's call. A tree that had fallen over the creek that offered about 3 feet of clearance above the hypothermic waters. I offer to cross first. Straddling this tree, I slide myself over the waters rushing below me, mistakenly seeing my pocket knife fall out of my pocket into those same waters. A mild inconvenience in any other situation could be the loss of a necessary tool for getting us out of this occasion. I crossed the river, choosing that creek bed to be the resting place for that knife. Josiah crosses after, clumsier than myself. His foot dips slightly into the creek, dampening his socks. Our time to get to the car is now cut into minutes if we do not get his foot warmed. We sit down, take off his boot, take off his sock. The cold wind and snow must have felt like knives against his skin. With our reduced movement of our cold fingers, I am helping him find a fresh pair of socks in my pack, as he was wearing his last 2 pairs. Socks are something I always bring enormous quantities of during trips. I find the socks. Josiah puts them on, struggles to put on his boot, but we eventually begin our voyage again. We traverse the last few miles of the wilderness and make ourselves back to the SUV. At this point, we are nearly running towards the vehicle. 5 inches of snow. I unlock the doors, dump our packs in the back, and turn the key. The car revs, and the sound of the engine roaring over the snow was like the cries of victory we deserved. I kept the car in park, pushed on the gas to rev the engine to about 2,000 RPM, heating up the cabin for the 2 of us. We could finally feel our fingers, our toes, and just everything. Driving back over the mountain, listening to the radio, weather forecasters mocking us by their explanations of how serious this unforeseen storm is, and that school districts all over the county were already closing for the following Monday. We got back to my farmhouse at the time, heat up coffee, eggs, and laugh about how we nearly died twice in the last 48 hours. After breakfast, after nearly dying, Josiah drives home. Camping is about challenging yourself and reconnecting to what mankind once was, with some added amenities. That trip was far more than the challenge either of us had in mind, but it added confidence to our ability to work together in bad situations, especially if you're stuck out in the middle of nowhere. I was about 14 years old when my dad went away on business for a couple of weeks, leaving me to tend the farm by myself. Mostly just feeding horses and chickens, not a big deal. The farm was way outside of town and down a dirt road. Nearest neighbors were 2 pastures away, and my dad insisted on never locking the doors, so we basically lived out in the middle of nowhere. After the first few nights, I started hearing tapping on the windows late at night, so obviously I broke Dad's rules and started locking the front and back doors. Then the window tapping advanced to doorknob rattling. And then I started finding odd things around the farm while doing chores. One morning, I found the horses stuffing themselves in the hay storage stall. The latch for that stall was very stiff and a little complicated, so it had obviously been opened by a person and not the horses. The worst morning, I stepped out on the back porch and found all the chickens sitting in a row along the side of a shed, evenly spaced, with their necks broken. One or two were still moving a bit. They looked set out on display. The chicken yard latch had obviously been opened by a person and left open deliberately. The worst part of all of this was when my dad finally came home, blamed me for every bit of oddness and disaster, and acted like I was stupid for being scared. He insisted that the horses opened the hay stall latch and that the dogs were responsible for the open chicken yard and line of posed broken-necked chickens. I think it's worth mentioning that our next-door neighbor was well known for being batshit crazy. Documented bits of crazy that my dad was entirely aware of, including putting bear traps in his haystack to catch the kids who had been playing in it, and blocking off a neighbor's driveway with a load of dirt as revenge for not letting him ride his horses on their property. So, my guess is batshit crazy neighbor could see that my dad's vehicle was gone, could hear my music turned up in the distance across the pastures, and figured terrorizing a middle school girl would be a fun hobby for a couple of weeks. I'm an avid hunter in a rural town in Missouri. My family hunts on public land, and we have hunted on the same ridge for multiple generations. The land used to be kept by a large sawmill that used mules to drag the trees to the mill in the nearby town. We have found all sorts of crazy stuff. Railroad spikes in the middle of the woods, horseshoes grown into the side of a tree where they hung it on a limb, and other bizarre things. One of the craziest things I've found in the woods was where a wagon had fell off the side of the ridge, taking the mules with it. It's something like a 200-foot drop, so they just left everything down there. I hiked by this thing 100 times going to and from our hunting spot. The woods all rotted from it, but the metal brackets and wheels were still there, grown over and taken back by nature. One day, while walking in the woods, I get to my spot that is probably half a mile from that spot, and I've been sitting there for a few hours when I hear what sounds like people yelling down the ridge, followed by a loud scream, and a crashing sound. I grab my gear and start on my way out. When I get by where the wagon debris was, a flower wreath laid over the wagon, but I've never seen anyone down there except for my family members, and no one knows who put it there. We talked about that night back at camp, and we could only assume that if somebody had died in that wagon, maybe it was some distant grandchild or something, and that day was the anniversary of it happening, but that still doesn't explain the sounds that I had heard. I still hunt down in the same place as always, but I've never heard or seen anything since. I used to own a horse boarding and training farm with about 45 acres surrounded by woods. I used to spend the night there quite a bit because I had to start chores early in the morning, so if I stayed too late, it wasn't worth it to drive home. One night, at about midnight, my dog started to bristle up and growl at the door of the office I slept in, and then my iPod, which I kept on a speaker in the middle of the barn, started blasting out Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire at full volume, which I definitely hadn't left it on. Let me tell you, that song is freaky as shit in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. Like, shit your pants freaky. My dog was full on growling and barking at the door, so I cracked it and let him run out, figuring that if someone were in or around the barn, he'd get them. Anyone there would have been trespassing at that time of night anyway. After a few minutes, I went out of the office into the barn aisle, with a bat of course, to turn off the creepy-ass music. The light I usually kept on so I could see around was off, so it was pitch dark in most of the barn. My dog was just staring out the barn door, which I kept open in the summer to keep the horses cooler, and his hair bristled but wasn't leaving the barn, which he was always allowed to do. I wrote it off as creepy as hell, but ultimately just one of those things, like it's weird and I can't explain it. But there's got to be an explanation I'm just not privy to. But the real scary part is that my property shared a private gate in back with the property closest to mine, which had a gate at the back as well. Most of my property was fenced because of the horses, and the property next to mine was like dozens of acres fenced with chain link fence, which, if you know anything about rural fencing, is not done that way. Anyways, we found out later that the owner of the adjoining property was Todd Colehep, the South Carolina serial killer. He had a woman chained up like a dog on his property, who he and his friends would sexually assault and walk around the property on a leash. He also had some bodies of people he killed buried on his property. He was doing all that stuff while I lived next to him. In fact, I used to ride on his property, but would always turn around if I heard machinery. In retrospect, probably burying bodies. Or got the creeps, like something would tell me to turn around and go home. I was probably one of the very few, if not only, person besides his friends who were sexually assaulting the woman to go on his property while all that was going on. A few years ago, I went camping for the first time in my life. I was about 11 or 12 when we headed out to a forest nearby our house. We were in Poland for the holidays, as we do every year, and right next to our house was a huge forest. So one day we decided to take out my mom's old tent she still had from like the 90s and just stay for the night or two in between some wildlife. Good thing. The place we chose to sleep at was only around 20, maybe 30 minutes away from the house. Bad thing, there are a lot, and I mean a lot of wolves, foxes, and bears out in that forest. And honestly, I kind of regretted going there in the first place, considering it's in the middle of nowhere. We set everything up at around 6 p.m. My sister and I set up the campfire. My dad chopped down a smaller tree earlier with his oak axe, important for later part of the story. And by now, it had dried out enough to catch fire. We sat around it for quite some time, probably around 4 hours, until it was dark, so we decided to just head to sleep then. My two sisters and I on one end of the tent and my parents on the other. It was probably just the fear of getting eaten alive by some wolves or homesickness, but I couldn't sleep at all. I heard my dad tell my mom he was going out into the forest to get some more wood for in the morning, while it was still fairly dry, or it could have all soaked up the dew by then. The thought of not having my dad around made it even worse for me to even close my eyes for a second. I'm not too good at telling what time it is by just staring at the sky or trying to figure out how long it has been, so I'll just say it was around 12 or 1 in the morning. I was actually falling asleep when I heard some rattling outside the tent. My first thought, wolf. I was terrified, and so just popped out my head through the little curtain that separated the two halves of the tent. Basically a piece of thin fabric just hanging on by threads, to see if my dad was back. He was still gone, and it has been about an hour since he went. I lay back down and just tried to fall asleep, but when I turned myself on my side, I saw this faint human shadow outside the tent. I froze and let out a teeny squeak. The person seemed to be holding some sort of axe, shovel-type thing in its hand, and so I thought it may have just been my dad who had come back. The shadow walked towards the entrance of the tent and just stood there at the zipped-up door for about 30 seconds. I began to wonder why he wasn't just coming inside. The person finally ran off into the forest, but it dropped the axe. You could hear the footsteps fade into the distance and a thump just appear along the way. Maybe a minute or so later, I hear my dad walking back from the opposite side of the forest and entered the tent all tired and just fell asleep. Seemed kind of sketchy and fishy and scary to me, but it was so late, I couldn't even think anymore, and I somehow fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up after my dad dropped his phone on his face, letting out an ouch. I peeped through the curtain at him, and he just smiled back while rubbing his nose. I needed some fresh air because I was feeling a bit sick. Maybe from the nerves in the morning or homesickness, I couldn't really tell. Both of us got out of the tent and walked around for a while. We circled around the campsite for about 10 minutes until we came back to our tent. That's when I noticed something that ran the chills down my back. A few meters from the tent, in the corner of my eye, I managed to catch a glimpse of something red. It took me a hot second to realize I actually saw something, and when I turned my head to see what it was a red and black rubber axe. It was not there before. I knew it wasn't my dad's because his was by the pile of wood he collected at night. From my dad's reaction, I probably turned pale because he started to freak out a little, like I was about to pass out or something. He turned his gaze to where I was looking, and we both just stared for a few seconds before he called out for the rest of the family to wake up and get moving. We were all packed up within an hour, and we rushed back home. I later told my dad what I saw that night, and he wouldn't believe me at first. I carried on with the story, and he finally realized I was telling the truth. To this day, I still have no clue who the hell that was. But I'm just happy he didn't investigate our tent any further or any other animal out in that forest. I've held this story in for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine in the middle of nowhere. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back and had dinner. It was all very normal until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler in a stereo that we bought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag, on the far right side of the tent away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the same time slept nearest the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and I felt fine. I had slept hard and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces, laying next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now. It was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car the night before and that an animal got into our stuff. I promised that I had locked it and went into the tent to grab the keys for my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground right next to the car. We quickly threw everything into the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he had had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent, holding his gun and just staring at him. When I tried to ask more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. I'm a 19-year-old female and a 23-year-old male, very short, and a friend, 21 female, I've known for a couple of years. We went camping earlier in 2020 in a big park, and around 12:30, a kind of drunk-looking old man came up to us on his bike playing policeman, saying that we weren't allowed to stay because we were disturbing the wildlife. He had been arguing with my boyfriend for the past 45 minutes. At that point, I have had enough. He would not leave us alone, and when I walked away from him, he yelled he was going to call the police on me for walking away from him. I was drunk, angry, and tired. If I didn't walk away, I would have probably beaten that old guy to death. I walked away anyway and called the police on him. He was annoying and just super creepy. We were just about to go to sleep when he came up to us, by the way. This is a park in the middle of nowhere. There is no wildlife other than the homeless people and some sheep here. The police said that they wanted to talk to him, so I walked back and put it on the speaker, and finally, he walked away after the police told him to leave us alone. The police said we were not allowed to be there, but they didn't bother. The police on the phone were very nice and understanding. It was my boyfriend and a good friend out in this park in a tent. Imagine a possibly drunk or high old guy coming up to you in the middle of a park in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere, not leaving you alone. Yes, I called the police. I didn't feel safe. The guy yelled at us for having a tent on the grass. I forgot to add this in earlier, but he tried taking a picture of us as some kind of evidence. We didn't want him to take our picture, so we said so. He was still trying to take a picture of us, though. Told us that he would stay and look at us till we left. He yelled multiple times that we weren't doing it fast enough. After that chaotic moment, we're gonna find somewhere else to camp, hopefully with no drunk or high old men. Me, my parents, and my friend were camping at a Tuckahoe State Park, and the last night we were staying there was very creepy. Me and my friend were hiking the trails all day, and we thought it would be a good idea to go to the lake to watch the sunset and talk about random things. There was a red car sitting in the parking lot near us, but we didn't see anyone around. This is important to know. It was almost dark out, so we decided to leave, but I had to go to the bathroom. When we got to the bathroom, there were no lights, so it was pitch black. I had to have my friend shine a flashlight. I was washing my hands, and the strange alarm started to go off, so me and my friend ran out of there, kind of creeped out. When we did get out of the bathroom, it was dark, and we had to walk back into a 1-mile trail back to our campsite. When we walked into the woods, my friend swore she seen a person standing in the near of the entrance of the path watching us walk onto the trail. The walk seemed so long and dreadful. I had this feeling someone, or maybe even something, was watching us. Not even a few minutes on the trail, I heard fast-moving footsteps and I started to see things out of the corners of my eyes. we decided to call my parents and tell them to hurry and come to the trail we were on. My friend's phone was about to die, and that was the only way we could have a light. After what seemed like ages of having the feeling of someone watching you and following you, we saw flashlights and noticed it was my parents. We ran and started telling them everything, but of course they didn't believe us. The next day, we were packing up our things, and I looked over, and there was the same red car just a few camping spots down from us. After that, I was ready to get out of there, just knowing that perhaps the same person was just a few spots down from me. Okay, so first off, this story has nothing to do with the paranormal. This is just a crazy experience that happened to me this past week while camping. Second off, I will be using some very offensive language throughout this post, but I want it to be clear, in no way does this reflect who I am in real life. So, if you are offended by racial slurs or harsh profanity, I recommend you stop listening right now. Okay, with all of that out of the way, I want to give you some info about how my family's campsite was set up. Altogether, there were 14 of us, including my baby niece and our friend's infant granddaughter, with people hopping in and out of the camp for work-related reasons. So, the campsite was split into 4, with my aunt and uncle on the top left, my cousin, her husband, and her baby on the top right, the friend of the family, which included 3 people and 1 baby, and finally, the bottom right, where me and my cousin, her boyfriend, my mom, and my sister were situated. Everything went off without a hitch for most of the week, with everyone having an overall good time. But just as we thought everything was going great, a car pulled into the campsite next to mine. 2 bald, middle-aged men got out of the car, who we didn't think much of at first. It was later that night when we got a taste of what we were in for. So, the way our campsite was positioned in the state park, we had to walk all the way down the street to get to the bathroom. So, this part of the story was told by my cousin, and I'm not 100% sure whether or not it happened. So right as we were going to bed, my cousin, her boyfriend, and my aunt were all walking to the bathroom to change when they were met to the sound of agonizing screaming, with one of the 2 men standing at the end of the road, punching himself in the face while screaming at the top of his lungs. Needless to say, they decided to turn around and go to a different bathroom. So the second experience happened to me when I woke up at around 9 a.m. to the sound of the 2 men having a decently loud conversation. I had just woken up, so the details are a bit fuzzy, but I vaguely remember them talking about how, and I quote here, quote, "the FBI doesn't have shit on us," end quote, and how, quote, "effing government is making AI judges to sexually assault our children." Now this all sounded like crazy talk, and to be honest, it got a little chuckle out of me when I first heard it. It was only when I walked to my aunt's campsite to eat breakfast and hearing my cousin's story that made me start to realize that there was something seriously wrong with these people. Okay, so the third story comes from my mom, who I tend to believe a bit more than my cousin, so I'm almost certain this one is true, as I was right there before it happened. While I was helping my mom take down our tents to pack up and put in our car to leave after dinner, I went to my aunt's campsite to get some water, when my mom claimed to hear them say, quote, "I'm going to sexually assault a N-word's mother," end quote, and other slurs too horrible to put in this story. Now, at this point, we were both disgusted and deeply disturbed. We had started to assume that these guys were some sort of schizophrenic neo-Nazis. However, this was not all. Halfway through the day, one of the guys left the campsite with a car to go do something, so me and my mom, thinking both of them were gone, saw it as an opportunity to go and change our clothes. However, on the way to the bathroom, we once again saw the second man walking towards his campsite. We thought that we were good on the walk back, thinking, with no one to talk to, he would just be quiet and go about his day. Well, right as we thought that, we heard him screaming at someone at the top of his lungs. But as we walked by the campsite, we noticed something. No car, and no other guy. This man was screaming at absolutely nothing, and I have no idea why, but it absolutely shook me to my core. I'm leaving in a few hours now, and all I can think to myself is, thank God that this is over, and I never have to even see those people ever again. Back in the mid-'80s, I was camping with my parents and a friend next to the Columbia River in Oregon. It was at one of those KOA type places my mom liked, but pleasant enough given that it wasn't overly crowded while we were there. My friend and I slept in a tent pitched next to the trailer and were up really late one night playing Risk and drinking copious amounts of soda. Both of us had to go to the bathroom and decided to go up to the camp's facilities instead of waking my parents by using the trailer toilet. Everyone else in the camp was fast asleep, but it was really noisy out due to all the frogs and crickets. On the walk up, neither of us were talking, and about halfway there, the hair on the back of my neck started to stand up, and I got this weird, chilled sensation. My friend stopped and put his arm out to stop me, and put his finger to his lips in a gesture to keep quiet. That's when I realized that there was no noise anywhere. No frogs, no crickets, nothing. I had this urge to bolt back to the tent, but it wasn't strong enough to actually get me moving. I looked over to my friend, and he was staring up at the night sky. I looked up too and didn't realize what I was seeing until the stars started appearing off to my left, slowly appearing from left to right. It was as if something gigantic was in the sky, blotting out the stars. But with the way the stars were reappearing, it must have had a straight trailing edge. Imagine yourself holding up a big piece of cardboard above your head at night, moving it from left to right. It felt like that. No lights though, no color, no noise, only the sensation of nothingness slowly moving off to our right. I don't know how long we watched, but by the time the stars had all reappeared up to the tops of the trees over by the river, the frogs and crickets had started to make noise again. We talked about what we thought it was before falling asleep, and decided to keep quiet about it the next day in hopes of hearing someone else in camp talking about it. But we heard nothing. We stayed there for a couple more days after that, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. By the way, the weather while we were there was beautiful with no clouds or fog. It still creeps me out to this day, but at the same time, fascinates me as to what it might have been. And that, dear listeners, brings a close to our true middle-of-nowhere stories. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you kindly. If you are awake, I hope you've enjoyed this collection. Until the next time, please take care of yourself. I'll be reading to you soon. Have yourself a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good night.